Hey, what's going on, guys? It's Pastor Matt back with another daily dose of defense. I know it's been a while since I've done a video, so my apologies. I had some issues with my camera, my recording equipment, and my computer, all kind of in succession. So I think we're back on track and we're ready to rock and roll. Now, as I've been preaching at the church, I've been preaching through the book of Matthew. I encourage you to go check those videos out. But as I've been preaching each week, it seems that I'm coming into into another part where Jesus is talking about a false teacher, or a false teaching, or something that would lead us to believe that we need to have knowledge about these things. And then when I'm talking about that, you know, I generally see that he's referring to the Pharisees, the Sadducees, the scribes, the leaders, the high priest, somebody of that nature, when he's talking about these things. And he's talking about how their teachings do not fall in line with the one true God. So in this video, what I want to do is I want to talk about all these false teachings, these places where he's calling out all these bad teachers, and just how much of the book is truly taken up by that. I was kind of surprised when I ran through and did all the stuff for this, just how much of the book is actually comprised of Jesus calling out false teachers. But the question really has to boil down to, if Jesus is willing to call out all these false teachers, why aren't we in the church willing to call out these false teachers? If he was willing to say something in his day, why in the modern church do we want to remain silent to these things? So Matthew has 28 chapters. The first two and the last one I could almost discount, but for the sake of numbers, we'll continue with those. The first two talk about the genealogy, the birth, and the early life of Jesus before he's ever considered a teacher. But then we get into chapter 3, and we're going to see that the first teaching isn't even done by Jesus. John the Baptist is baptizing people, and the scribes and the Pharisees come, and he even refers to them as as having a lack of understanding in their teaching, the fact that they don't know what they're talking about when they're teaching. He calls out the teachings, the leaders of the church, as being inadequate, and that their teachings are wrong-minded. In chapter 4, we see the temptation of Jesus by Satan, and Satan is there, and he's trying to twist the words of the Old Testament. Now, he's twisting them to Jesus, who probably knows the Old Testament much better than Satan does, and knows even the context in which these words are to be held. So Satan's trying to pull these words out of context, and Jesus is seen going through and putting them into the right context for us. And he shows how this is still done. And it's still done in our church today. As I've pointed out several times, people will take parts of verses or verses out of context and make them say what they want them to say. The latter half of Matthew 5, Jesus spends correcting bad interpretations of the laws. And he's correcting these teachings of men that are put directly in opposition to the teachings of God. Matthew 6 calls out the leaders for their hypocrisies, and they were doing things just to be seen by those in the public square. They weren't doing them to actually be holy, but to be seen. In Matthew 7, Jesus discussed that there were false prophets and false teachers, and that these false prophets and false teachers were wolves in sheep's clothing. You would think that they were the ones who were there to care for the church, the ones who were there to put out the good information, but instead they were wolves in sheep's clothing. They were there to detract. They were there to distract. Chapter 8, there's actually nothing about bad teachers, but in chapter 9, Jesus discussed with the teachers they needed to reach out to those who were sick. Right? Jesus is there with Matthew and his companions, and they're like, oh, he's a glutton and a drunkard because he hangs out with sinners. And Jesus says it's not the well who need a doctor, it's the sick. I could almost hear him saying at the end, why don't you practice that sometime? Well, of course he doesn't. In the 10th chapter, Jesus talks about the fact that teachers, leaders, and even their own families would come against them for their beliefs in him. In the 11th chapter, Jesus calls out the unrepentant cities and says, it'll be better for, Tyre and Sidon in the last days. In chapter 12, he shows that the thought processes of the teachers is twisted and wrong when they say they are able to defeat when they say that he is able to defeat the evil one because he was sent from the evil one. He's like, that's not even logically sound. That doesn't follow. Martin Luther King Jr. even said, hate cannot drive out hate, only love can do that. And he's showing that we have to be able to logically infer our faith, that it's not just this easy believism. The parable of the seeds in chapter 13, Jesus clearly states that there are false teachings. Specifically in verses 19 and 23, he says, anyone who hears the word of the kingdom and does not understand it, the evil one comes and snatches away what has been sown in his heart. This is the one on whom the seed was sown beside the road. The one on whom seed was sown on the rocky places, this is the man who hears the word and immediately receives it in joy. Yet he has no firm root in himself, but is only temporary. And when affliction or persecution arise because of the word, immediately he falls away. And one who is sown among the swords, this is the man who hears the word, and worry of the world and deceitfulness of wealth choke out the word, and it becomes unfruitful. And the one on whom the seed was sown on good soil, this is the man who hears the word and understands it, and indeed bears fruit, and brings forth some 100-fold, some 60, and some 30. Right, so he's saying, hey, there are other teachers who are going to come against you, and they're going to bring deceit, and they're going to bring judgment, and don't listen to these people, because that's the thorns, that's the rocky ground, right? Note in each of these, he's talking about these people actually received the gospel, and they started to believe, but were pulled away for one reason or another. And he also continues in this chapter with the parable of the wheat and the tares, the wheat being those who came up under good teaching, the tares being those who did not. Chapter 14 begins with the beheading of John the Baptist by Herod the Tetrarch. Now we know that Herod was kind of sort of a Jewish individual, but he had fallen under really bad teachings, and he feared his wife more than he feared God. Chapter 15, Jesus goes against the teachings of men. Right? He says that the teachers, they disobeyed God, but they followed men, and that they were doing this by pointing at, they would point at a teaching, and Jesus like, it was the hand washing. They were pointing at the hand washing, and Jesus like, you guys dishonor God by your obedience to men, because you're forsaking your mothers and fathers. In chapter 16, the Pharisees are again trying to trap Jesus in a teaching, but by saying, hey, show us a sign and we'll believe, and Jesus says, you're too busy looking for a sign that you're missing them all. Right? He's talking about the healings and the feedings and the, all of these things, the demons leaving in his name. And then chapter 17 is the second chapter amongst his teaching ministry, where we don't see him calling out bad teaching. And in chapter 18 he talks about stumbling blocks that will start to lead people away from the faith because it's going to be in their way. And he says that these stumbling blocks are condemned, and this is those who were teaching falsely. Not just in that time, but even in ours. There are people who will lead people astray. They are stumbling blocks. In chapter 19, Jesus comes against Pharisees, telling them that it's because of the hardness of the people's hearts that God allows divorce. Right? He made an allowance for it, not just buck wild, go ahead and get divorced whenever you want, for any reason you want. And he calls them out for their failure to follow God, and he talks about the fact that they do not love God with all their hearts, minds, souls. On chapter 20, he discusses how the leaders and teachers in the synagogues would hand him over to be crucified. because they weren't willing to follow the law themselves. Chapter 21, he drives the money changers out of the temple, which is pretty awesome. You get a guy coming in, throwing a table around, creating a whip out of cords, kicking him out of the temple for living by the laws of man and not the laws of God. He counters the Pharisees in chapter 22, who are attempting to trap him with regards to taxes, the poll tax. And he says, hand me a denarius, whose picture is on this? And they say Caesar's, and they say, give to Caesar what is Caesar's. And then he says, give to God what is God's. And he's talking about image, and the image of God being God's. And he's showing them again that they're not worshiping God with their hearts, their minds, their souls. And he even calls that out later. And he also counters the Sadducee teaching regarding the resurrection. Chapter 23 is interesting in that Jesus gives the 8 woes to the Pharisees. Number 1 is they teach about God, but they don't teach who God is. They devoured widows' houses, right? They were kicking the widows out and keeping it for themselves. They taught that an oath sworn by the temple or altar was not binding. They taught that a law, but did not practice some of the most important parts of the law. They presented the appearance of being clean, but were unclean. And he says, you're whitewashed tombs, full of dead men's bones. They exhibited themselves being righteous, but were scrupulous keepers of the law, right? They would hunt and peck for little misdeeds. They professed high regard for the dead prophets of old. However, they were the ones who were involved in the killing of these prophets. He shows that throughout this list there was no love for God. They didn't love God. That's not why they were doing any of this. They merely loved the position that they held, this position of authority over the people. On chapter 24, he gives an example of teachings that will mislead his followers when he says, see to it that no one misleads you, for many will come in my name, saying, I am the Christ, and will mislead many. You will be hearing of wars and rumors of wars, so see that you are not frightened, for those things must take place, but that is not yet the end. For nation will rise against nation, and kingdom against kingdom, and in various places there will be famines and earthquakes. But all these things are merely the beginning of birth pangs. Then at the tail end of chapter 25, Jesus shows there will be many who are teaching in his name who aren't his. At the end, they will come to me and they will say, Lord, Lord, did we not prophesy in your name? Did we not heal? Did we not do this? And he says, depart from me, for I never knew you. In chapter 26, Jesus shows us what the teachers thought of who Jesus was, right? And while he's not teaching about their errors, we can see this on the trial. During the trial, the high priest, he tore his robes and he said, he has blasphemed. What further need do we have of witnesses? Behold, you have now heard the blasphemy. What do you think? And they answered, he deserves death. They believed he deserved death, but they weren't willing to impart it upon themselves. And then in chapter 27, we see the chief priests and the Pharisees commanding the people. They're commanding the people to desire a murderer, Barabbas, over Jesus, who was calling out their bad teachings. Their power is what they use to demand this. And while chapter 28 does not tell us about bad teachers or bad teaching, right? It tells us about the Great Commission, and it tells us about the resurrection. It's the shortest chapter. But this does mean that five chapters out of 28 in the book of Matthew do not discuss bad teachers. 5 out of 28 do not discuss bad teachers. It means 23 of 28 do, or about 82.1%. That's an insane amount. So with all these discussions regarding bad teachers and bad teachings in Jesus' own ministry, why do we, as a church, as a whole church, largely fail to discuss bad teachers in the church? This is a problem that we have to look at, and we have to be ready to discuss. So over the next little while, I'm going to talk about where some of that comes from in our own church today, how we counter it, and what some of these bad teachings look like and things they taught from the early church on. And by the time we get to Augustine, he had already seen over 400 different heresies in history. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to break down kind of the main things that each of these were talking about, and kind of how we as Christians counter those. I thank you for watching. And this has been another Daily Dose of Defense. Thanks for watching, and God bless.